10 years ago, my father, young Sik, looked me in the eyes and promised I would be safe. He pried my small hands off his car door and sent me to a safe house in the middle of nowhere. He told me to stay quiet and live like a normal girl. But the second he drove away, the shadows moved. He didn't send me away to save me. He sent me away to be forgotten. I spent a decade in a living hell, learning that in this world, protection is just another word for abandonment. Now, the great young Sik is finally on his knees. His empire is crumbling, and he is waiting for the rival Viper boss to walk through the door and finish the job. The door hisses open, and he sees me. I'm not wearing the white dress he remembers. I'm Ji-Hye, and I'm wearing a blood-red suit with a gun that bears his own family crest. He calls me his precious daughter, but I just pull the trigger at his feet. I didn't come home for a hug. I came back to show him that the girl he discarded is now the only one holding the leash. The fog over the Incheon docks was thick, smelling of salt and diesel, but it couldn't hide the flickering orange flames of the burning shipping crates. Young Sik's men, the few who remained loyal to the old ways, stood trembling as a fleet of black SUVs cut through the mist. The headlights acted like searchlights, pinning them against the rusted steel of the containers. This was the official declaration of war. The Vipers were no longer a rumor. They were a physical force, and they had come to claim the city's heart. The door to the lead SUV opened, and Ji-Hye stepped out. The red of her suit was so vibrant, it seemed to bleed into the surrounding fog. She didn't look like the frightened child who had been smuggled out of these very docks 10 years ago. She looked like the Reaper. Behind her, dozens of masked soldiers stood in perfect, terrifying formation, the silver Viper pins on their collars glinting in the light. In the center of the clearing, tied to a wooden pallet, was Elder Park. He was one of young Sik's oldest advisors, a man who had shared meals at their family table. He had been caught trying to sell the syndicate's northern drug routes to the Dragon Syndicate. He looked up, his eyes bulging with terror as he recognized a woman approaching him. "Ji-Hye," he croaked, blood coughing from his lip. "Please, I knew your father when he was nothing. I held you when you were a baby. Tell these monsters to let me go." Ji-Hye stopped a foot away from him. She didn't look disgusted or angry. She looked bored. She reached out and adjusted the man's crooked tie with a delicate, steady hand. "You held me as a baby, Park? Then you should have remembered how I cry when I'm betrayed. I did it for the family." Park pleaded, his voice cracking. "Young Sik is old. He's weak. I was trying to save us." "You were trying to save yourself," Ji-Hye corrected him, her voice a low, freezing rasp. "My father is a relic, it's true, but he is my relic to destroy. You are just a leak that needs to be plugged." She didn't hesitate. She didn't look away. Ji-Hye pulled a sleek, suppressed pistol from her waistband and fired a single shot. The sound was no louder than a dry branch snapping. Park's body went limp against the ropes, the life leaving his eyes before he could even blink. She turned back to her soldiers, her face an unreadable mass of ice. "Send the video of this to my father's office," she commanded. "Let the old guard know that the Vipers are here. The city doesn't belong to the ghosts anymore. It belongs to me." She stepped back into her car without a second glance at the man who had once been her uncle. As the engine roared to life, the docks fell back into a heavy, suffocating silence. The war had begun, and the first drop of blood was family. The Grand Hotel was filled with the smell of expensive tobacco and the silent tension of a battlefield. This was a neutral zone, where the city's most dangerous predators gathered to trade blood for luxury. At the front of the room, a large crystal screen displayed the evening's final prize. The Huang family estate, the ancestral fortress that young Sik had lost to the banks during the recent chaos. Young Sik sat in the front row, his hands gripped tightly onto his cane. He had liquidated his remaining secret accounts and sold his last favors just for this moment. To him, the house wasn't just wood and stone. It was a symbol of his legacy. He needed it back to prove he was still the king. "We begin the bidding at $10 million, the auctioneer announced, his voice smooth and cold. $15 million. Young Sik called out immediately, his voice raspy but firm. He looked around the room, daring anyone to challenge him. The other bosses looked away, out of respect or perhaps pity for the dying lion. 20 million. A clear, calm voice rang out from the back of the hall. The room went ice cold. Young Sik stiffened, recognizing that tone instantly. He turned in his seat to see Ji-Hye leaning against a velvet-covered wall. She was dressed in a sharp, charcoal-gray suit, twirling a gold fountain pen between her fingers. She didn't look like a bidder. She looked like the owner of the building. 25 million. Young Sik barked, his face flushing a deep purple. 30. Ji-Hye countered without a second's hesitation. 35. Young Sik's voice cracked. It was nearly all he had left. 50 million, Ji-Hye said, her voice barely a whisper yet filling every corner of the ballroom. The auctioneer's gavel struck the wood with a final, echoing thud. Sold to the lady in the back. Young Sik stood up, his legs shaking. Ji-Hye, stop this. That is your childhood home. Our ancestors built those walls. Why are you doing this? Ji-Hye walked down the center aisle, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. She reached the stage and took the paper deed from the auctioneer. She didn't look at the crowd. She only looked at her father. Our ancestors built it, father. But you let it fall. You told me the family was everything. Yet you let the walls crumble while you hid in your vault. She pulled a silver lighter from her pocket. With a flick of her thumb, a small blue flame danced in the dim light. She held the corner of the $50 million deed to the fire. The paper caught instantly, the edges curling into black ash that drifted onto the expensive carpet. You can't reclaim your history, young Sik, she said, watching the flames reach her fingertips before dropping the burning remains at his feet. The house is gone. The name is mine. And from now on, you don't even own the ground you stand on. She turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving the most powerful men in the city to watch the ashes of the Huang legacy burn out on the floor. The rain drummed against the tin roof of the cabin like 1,000 tiny hammers, but 12-year-old Ji-Hye hardly heard it. She sat on her small bed, staring at the clock. It had been 3 days since her father, young Sik, had kissed her forehead and promised he would return before the weekend. He had called this place a safe house, but to her, it felt like a cage hidden in the middle of a dark, rotting forest. Suddenly, the front door didn't just open, it exploded. The sound of splintering would drown out the rain. Ji-Hye froze, her heart leaping into her throat. These weren't her father's men. They didn't knock. They didn't call out her name. They moved with the heavy, violent footsteps of hunters who had finally found their prey. Find the girl, a man shouted. If we have the daughter, young Sik will hand over the docks by sunrise. Ji-Hye scrambled into bed, her breath coming in jagged gasps. She remembered what her father had told her. If the bad men come, I will be right behind them. But as she watched the shadows of 3 men enter her room, she realized with a cold, sinking horror that no one was coming. The safe house wasn't a fortress. It was a distraction. Her father hadn't hidden her to keep her safe. He had hidden her so his enemies wouldn't use her to weaken his position. Her hand brushed against a loose floorboard beneath the bed. She remembered young Sik showing her a secret compartment years ago, a place he said was for emergencies only. She pulled the board back. Inside sat a heavy, black pistol. The bed was flipped over with a violent roar. A man with a scarred face reached down to grab her hair. Found you, little princess, he sneered. Ji-Hye didn't cry. She didn't beg. The warmth of the child she used to be died in that instant. She swung the heavy weapon up with both hands, the weight of it nearly breaking her small wrists. She pulled the trigger just as her father had taught her during those fun afternoons at the range. The explosion was deafening. The man fell back, the light leaving his eyes. The other 2 froze in shock. Ji-Hye didn't wait for them to move. She fired again and again until the room went silent, save for the ringing in her ears and the smell of gunpowder. She stood up among the bodies, her white dress stained with the reality of her father's world. She looked at the phone on the wall, the emergency line to her father's office. It sat silent. He hadn't called. He hadn't checked in. He had left her here to be a sacrifice. That night, the girl named Ji-Hye vanished in the woods. When she finally walked out of the trees, she wasn't a daughter anymore. She was a survivor, and she had learned the only lesson that mattered. In the Mafia, Blood isn't thicker than water. It's just another currency to be spent. The invitation was printed on heavy, cream-colored cardstock with a gold embossed seal of the Huang Syndicate. It was an olive branch, a formal request for a peace summit at a secluded mountain tea house. Young Sik sat at the head of the low table, flanked by his 4 top generals. These men were the pillars of his empire, grizzled veterans who had survived decades of street wars. They wore expensive silk suits, but their eyes were restless, their hands never straying far from the weapons hidden beneath the table. "The Viper boss is young and arrogant," General Kong spat, checking his watch. "She thinks because she burned a piece of paper at an auction, she owns us. We should end this tonight." Young Sik raised a hand for silence. He was tired. His heart wasn't in the fight anymore, but his pride demanded he meet this rival face to face. He still didn't know the Viper's true identity. He only knew she was efficient, cold, and winning. The sliding shoji doors creaked open. Ji-Hye stepped into the room, draped in a tailored charcoal coat that she shed to reveal a sharp, black pinstripe suit. She didn't bow. She didn't acknowledge the status of the men in the room. She sat directly opposite her father, her movements as fluid and dangerous as a blade. "You're late," General Kong growled, leaning forward to intimidate her. Ji-Hye didn't look at him. She poured herself a cup of tea, the liquid steady and unmoving. "I'm exactly on time for a funeral, General. I just wasn't sure whose it would be yet." The generals bristled, their faces turning a deep, angry red. "Listen, girl," General Choi barked, slamming his fist on the table. "You've taken a few docks and a house. That doesn't make you a king. You're playing a man's game with a child's temper." Ji-Hye set her tea down with a soft clack. "A man's game? Is that why your northern drug routes are currently being seized by my men? Is that why General Choi's private offshore account was emptied 3 hours ago?" The room went deathly silent. Choi's face went pale. Ji-Hye pulled a stack of photos from her pocket and tossed them onto the table. They showed each general in compromising positions, one meeting with the police, another funneling money to a rival gang. "You call yourselves pillars," Ji-Hye said, her voice a low, mocking whisper. "But you're just termites. You've been eating my father's empire from the inside out while he was too busy dreaming of the past to notice." One by one, she dismantled them. She knew their secrets, their debts, and their cowardice. She didn't use a gun. She used the truth like a garrote wire, tightening it until they couldn't breathe. The powerful generals who had spent the morning laughing were now staring at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. Young Sik watched in stunned silence. He saw the cold brilliance in her eyes and the way she commanded the room without raising her voice. He felt a strange, terrifying flicker of recognition. This wasn't just a rival. This was a masterclass in power. "The summit is over," Ji-Hye announced. Standing up, she looked at the generals with pure disgust. "I don't negotiate with subordinates. I only talk to the man at the top. And right now, Young Sik, you're the only one in this room still worth my breath." The summit room felt like a pressure cooker. Young Sik gripped the edge of the low table, his knuckles white. The humiliated generals had retreated into the shadows of the room, leaving him alone with the woman who was systematically dismantling his life. He stared at the Viper boss, searching for a weakness, a flicker of hesitation. Anything that would explain how a stranger knew his organization better than he did. "You speak of my daughter as if she were a ghost," Young Sik growled, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and grief. "You mock my precious flower, but you know nothing of the sacrifice I made to keep her clean. You are a cold, nameless mercenary. You have no right to use her name to hurt me." Ji-Hye stared at him, her expression as flat as a sheet of ice. The nameless mercenary comment didn't make her angry. It made her pity him. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silk handkerchief. "You always were blinded by your own intentions, Young Sik," she said softly. She raised the cloth to her left cheek. With a slow, deliberate motion, she began to scrub. The heavy, professional-grade foundation came away in streaks of beige and tan, revealing the truth hidden beneath the mask. Under the harsh overhead lights, a jagged, silver-white scar emerged. It ran from the corner of her eye down to the edge of her jaw, a violent, uneven ridge of skin that told a story of fire, glass, and a night where a little girl had to fight her way out of the grave. Young Sik gasped, the sound catching his throat like a shard of glass. He recognized that mark. He had seen the medical photos from the safe house raid 10 years ago, the report that said no one could have survived such a wound. He looked at the shape of her eyes, the set of her chin, and the cold fire that burned in her gaze. "Ji-Hye," he whispered, his voice breaking into 1,000 pieces. My little girl? The little girl died in that cabin, father," Ji-Hye said, throwing the stained cloth onto the table. It landed on the photos of the traitorous generals. "She waited for you to come. She bled for you. But the woman standing here today? I was born from the ash you left behind. You didn't keep me clean. You left me to rot. So I learned how to grow in the dark." The realization hit young Sik harder than any bullet. The monster he had been trying to kill, the rival he had been trying to outmaneuver, was the very legacy he claimed to be protecting. He hadn't been fighting a stranger. He had been fighting the consequences of his own cowardice. Ji-Hye leaned forward, her face inches from his. The scar pulsed with a life of its own. "Look at me, young Sik. Look at what your protection did. I am the viper because you were too weak to be the dragon. And now, the daughter you failed is here to take the one thing you loved more than me, your crown." The tea house had become a tomb of silence. Young Sik sat paralyzed, staring at the scarred face of the daughter he had once called his precious flower. But in the shadows of the room, the 4 generals weren't feeling grief or regret. They felt only fear, and fear in the underworld quickly turns into treachery. General Kong caught the eye of the others. He saw the sweat on their brows and the way their hands trembled. They had just been humiliated by a woman half their age, and their leader, the great young Sik, was weeping like a broken old man. To the old guard, this wasn't a family reunion. It was a liability. If Ji-Hye took the throne, they were dead. If young Sik stayed in power, they were weak. As Ji-Hye turned her back to gather her things, Kong leaned toward General Choi. "The old man has lost his mind," he whispered, his voice like grinding stones. "He won't pull the trigger on his own blood, and she won't stop until we are all in the dirt." Choi nodded, his eyes cold and sharp. "They are both a threat to the business. If we remove the father and the daughter tonight, the city belongs to the council. We tell the streets they killed each other. A tragic family murder-suicide. It was the oldest play in the book. The generals had spent decades serving the Huang Syndicate, but their loyalty was only as deep as their pockets. They didn't care about the scar on Ji-Hye's face or the tears in young Sik's eyes. They only cared about the power vacuum that was currently opening up in the center of the room. "Do it," Kong signaled. Outside the tea house, the silent forest began to crawl with men. These weren't Ji-Hye's Vipers or young Sik's loyal guards. These were the private mercenaries of the council, shadows moving through the trees with silenced rifles. They had been given a simple order: leave no one alive. Inside, Ji-Hye froze. Her ears, sharpened by years of surviving the slums, caught the faint click of a safety being switched off behind her. She didn't look back at the generals. She looked at her father. For a split second, the mask of the Viper boss slipped, and the 12-year-old girl who had been left in the woods returned. "Father," she said, her voice tight and low, "your pillars are about to collapse on both of us." Young Sik looked up, finally seeing the hunger in his advisors' faces. He realized too late that by trying to protect Ji-Hye from the world, he had invited the real monsters into his own home. The council rose as one, guns drawn, just as the first window shattered from a sniper's bullet. The blood-red return had just become a fight for survival. The tea house exploded into chaos. As the first sniper round shattered the peace, Ji-Hye didn't dive for cover like a frightened victim. She moved with a cold, calculated precision that left young Sik breathless. She realized instantly that the council hadn't just come for her. They had come to erase the entire Huang bloodline. Despite the decade of bitterness burning in her chest, a strange, dark instinct took over. She didn't want her father to die at the hands of these cowards. He was her prey, her ghost to settle. If he died now, his sins died with him, and Ji-Hye wasn't ready to let him off that easily. "Stay down, old man," she barked, kicking the heavy oak table onto its side to create a barrier for young Sik. Before the council's mercenaries could even breach the doors, Ji-Hye tapped her earpiece. Code black. Clear the perimeter. Leave no witnesses. She hadn't come to this summit alone. While the council thought they were surrounding a vulnerable woman, Ji-Hye's elite Viper snipers had been ghosting them from the tree lean for hours. Outside, the night air filled with a muffled thwip-thwip of suppressed rifles. One by one, the council's assassins fell into the dirt, silenced before they could pull their triggers. Inside the room, General Kong lunged forward, a hidden blade glinting in the dim light. He aimed for Young Sik's throat, hoping to finish at least one task. Ji-Hye was faster. She didn't use her gun. She caught his wrist, the bone snapping under her grip with a sickening crunch. She leaned in close, her scarred face inches from his. "You thought you could steal my kill?" she whispered, her voice like a freezing wind. "My father belongs to me. You don't get to touch what I haven't finished breaking." With a brutal shove, she sent the general crashing into the wall. Outside, the gunfire stopped as quickly as it had begun. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. Ji-Hye stood in the center of the room, her pinstripe suit perfectly clean, while her father cowered in the shadows of the overturned table. Young Sik looked up at her, his eyes filled with a terrifying mix of hope and confusion. You saved me, Ji-Hye." She looked down at him, her eyes as hard as flint. She holstered her weapon and adjusted her cuffs. "Don't confuse protection with love, Young Sik. I didn't save you because I care. I saved you because you still owe me a kingdom, and I'm not done watching you lose it." She turned toward the door, leaving him trembling on the floor. The council's plot had failed, but for Young Sik, the real nightmare was only beginning. He was safe from the assassins, but he was trapped with the monster he had created. The following week, the underworld hummed with a scandalous rumor. The Viper Queen had been wounded in the mountain ambush. Word spread that Ji-Hye was hiding in a weakened state at an abandoned shipyard. Her elite guard spread thin. It was a perfect opening. The council, smelling blood and desperate to regain control, mobilized every soldier they had left to finish what they started at the tea house. Young Sik heard the news and felt a frantic, paternal panic he hadn't felt in years. He didn't stop to think. He didn't check the facts. He only knew that his daughter, the girl with the scar he had caused, was in danger again. He gathered his few remaining loyalists and raced toward the shipyard, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had failed to save her 10 years ago. He would not fail her tonight. When Young Sik arrived, the shipyard was eerie and silent. He saw Ji-Hye slump against a rusted shipping container, her red suit stained and her head bowed. She looked small, fragile, the damsel he had always tried to protect. "Ji-Hye!" he screamed, limping toward her with his gun drawn. "I'm here. I've got you." But as he reached the center of the yard, the heavy industrial floodlights suddenly hissed to life, blinding him. From the darkness above the containers, the remaining members of the council emerged, led by General Kong. They were laughing. "Look at this," Kong sneered, stepping into the light. "The old lion comes running to save the cub. We get to kill you both in one cage. It's almost poetic." Young Sik threw himself in front of Ji-Hye, shielding her with his body. "Run, Ji-Hye. I'll hold them off." Then the air changed. A low, cold chuckle vibrated from behind Young Sik. Ji-Hye stood up slowly, brushing the dust off her pristine red sleeves. There was no wound. There was no weakness. Her eyes were bright, with a predatory gleam. She didn't look like a girl who needed saving. She looked like the one who had set the bait. "You really never learn, do you, father?" she whispered. At her signal, the walls of the shipyard, the shadows they thought were empty, filled with the red laser dots of 100 Viper rifles. Every single council member now had a scarlet dot resting on their forehead. The hunters were suddenly the prey. Young Sik looked around, his mouth agape. He realized with a sickening jolt that he wasn't the hero of this story. He was just the final piece of the trap. Ji-Hye had used his own guilt to lure the council into a killing zone they could never escape. "I told you, Young Sik," she said, stepping around to face the terrified generals. "In my world, there are no damsels. There are only those who pull the trigger and those who wait to be hit. Tonight, you're just a spectator." The smoke from the shipyard ambush had barely cleared when Ji-Hye led her father back to his own office. Young Sik stumbled toward his leather chair, his body aching, but Ji-Hye stepped in front of it. She didn't sit. She simply placed a thick stack of legal folders on the desk. They were stamped with the logos of offshore banks and shell companies he didn't recognize. You spent your whole life thinking power came from the barrel of the gun, father, Ji-Hye said, her voice smooth and dangerous. But while you were counting your bullets, I was counting your interest rates. Young Sik frowned, his trembling fingers opening the first folder. His eyes widened as he saw the signatures. Every loan he had taken to keep the syndicate afloat during the war, every mortgage on his properties, and every secret bailout for his failing drug routes had been bought out. Viper Holdings? Crimson Crest? Who are these people? He stammered. They are me, Ji-Hye replied. She leaned over the desk, the light of the desk lamp catching the jagged ridge of the scar on her cheek. I didn't just come back to kill you, Young Sik. I came back to buy you. For the last 2 years, I have been the one paying your guard salaries. I have been the one keeping the lights on in this building. Every breath you take in this office is a debt you owe to me. Young Sik felt the floor drop out from under him. The realization was more painful than any wound. He had fought so hard to keep his legacy alive, only to find out that his daughter had turned his legacy into a cage. He wasn't a king anymore. He was a tenant in his own empire. You can't do this, he whispered. The syndicate belongs to the bloodline. You're my daughter. And as your daughter, I'm simply collecting what I'm owed, she countered. She pulled out a final document, a total transfer of assets. This is the debt of blood. You abandoned me to the wolves to save your money. Now, your money has brought me back to take everything else. Sign the papers, or the banks will seize this building by morning, and my men will ensure you don't make it to the sidewalk. The room was silent, except for the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock. Young Sik looked at the pen, then at the cold, beautiful monster he had created. He realized that Ji-Hye had won a war he didn't even know was being fought. With a shaking hand, he reached for the pen. He wasn't just signing away his money. He was signing away his life to the girl he had once tried to erase. The sky over the city was a bruised purple, reflecting the neon lights and the smoke rising from the burning outskirts. While Young Sik sat defeated in his office, the rest of the Huang Syndicate was still preparing for a war they had already lost. The Dragon's Den, the fortified skyscraper that served as the Syndicate's headquarters, was supposed to be impenetrable. It was a fortress of concrete steel and old-world pride. But Ji-Hye didn't believe in walls. She believed in fire. At exactly midnight, the power to the city block died. The Dragon's Den plunged into darkness. A second later, the silence was shattered by a synchronized explosion that blew the armored front doors off their hinges. This wasn't a street brawl. It was a military strike. The Vipers didn't shout or scream. They moved in perfect silence, their tactical gear making them look like ghosts in the strobing emergency lights. Ji-Hye walked through the front entrance, her red suit a stark contrast to the black-clad soldiers surrounding her. She stepped over the shattered glass and the bodies of guards who had been too slow to drop their weapons. She didn't even draw her gun. She didn't need to. Her presence alone felt like a death sentence to the men inside. On the upper floors, the old guard loyalists tried to mount a defense. They used heavy furniture as cover and fired wildly into the stairwells. They fought with the desperation of men who knew their era was ending. But the Vipers moved with a cold, modern efficiency. They used flashbangs and gas, clearing room after room with a speed that made the old Mafia tactics look like a joke. As Ji-Hye reached the executive floor, she found the last of the council's supporters barricaded in the boardroom. They were the men who had once looked down on her, the ones who called her a fragile flower. She signaled her men to hold their fire. She kicked the double doors open herself. The men inside were shaking, their expensive suits soaked in sweat. They looked at her and saw the face of the girl they had tried to kill 10 years ago, now merged with the queen of a new, ruthless world. "The dragon is dead," Ji-Hye said, her voice echoing in the hollow room. "I've taken your docks, I've taken your money, and now I'm taking your home." She watched as they threw their guns onto the floor. It was over. In a single night, the decade-long reign of the Huang Syndicate had been erased. The old world of the Mafia built on tea houses and secret handshakes, had been crushed by the machine Ji-Hye built in the dark. As the sun began to rise over the skyline, the Viper stood atop the building, and for the first time in history, the city truly belonged to a woman. The dust had settled over the city, and the fires at the headquarters were being contained by men wearing Viper pins. Inside the penthouse office, the air was still and heavy with the scent of expensive scotch and old regrets. Young Sik sat behind his massive desk, but he looked smaller than he ever had. The gold-plated nameplate, that red chairman, felt like a mockery. Ji-Hye stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the sunrise hit the skyline she now controlled. She turned slowly, her heels clicking on the hardwood with a finality that made young Sik flinch. In her hand, she held a single sheet of paper, the total abdication of the Huang bloodline. "It's time, father," she said, her voice devoid of heat. She tossed the paper onto the desk. "Sign it, and the war officially ends. Refuse, and the Vipers will spend the rest of the morning hunting down every person who still carries your name." Young Sik looked at the pen, his hand hovering over the paper. "You've won, Ji-Hye. You've taken my money, my men, and my pride. Is it not enough? Do you really want to see your father in a grave?" "A grave is too easy," Ji-Hye replied, leaning over the desk until her scarred cheek was illuminated by the morning sun. "You didn't give me a grave 10 years ago. You gave me a quiet life. You gave me a small house in the middle of nowhere and told me to be a normal girl while the world burned around me." She leaned back, a cold, thin smile touching her lips. "I'm not going to kill you, young Sik. I've already bought a small cottage in the countryside. It has no phone lines, no internet, and no guards. There is a garden you can tend to and a fence you can paint. You wanted a simple life for your daughter? Now you're going to live it." Young Sik's eyes widened with horror. To a man who had ruled an empire with an iron fist, the thought of being a nameless old man in a quiet village was a fate worse than death. It was total erasure. "You can't keep me there," he whispered. "I'll rot. I'll go mad." "You'll be safe," Ji-Hye countered, throwing his own words back at him like a handful of salt. "Isn't that what you wanted from me? To be clean? To be away from the blood? Well, now you're clean. You're retired." With a trembling hand, young Sik signed the document. As the last ink dried, Ji-Hye snatched the paper away. She didn't offer a hug or goodbye. She signaled to the 2 masked soldiers at the door. "Take him to the car," she commanded. "Make sure he has his gardening tools. He's earned his peace." As they dragged the former king out of the room, he looked back at her one last time. But Ji-Hye was already sitting in his chair, her eyes fixed on the city below. She had sentenced him to the very cage he had built for her, and for the first time in a decade, the debt was paid. The penthouse office of the Dragon's Den was silent, the air filled only with the faint hum of the city's heartbeat below. Ji-Hye sat in the high-backed leather chair that once belonged to her father. The weight of the world felt heavy on her shoulders, but she didn't let it show. She adjusted her sleeves, her fingers brushing against the cold gold of young Sik's signet ring, which she now wore on her own hand. It was a trophy of a war won, but it felt like a shackle. The heavy doors opened. A man stepped in, his silhouette tall and confident. It was Min Jun, the heir to the tech empire that had secretly funded her rise. He was the only person who had seen her bleed and still stood by her side. He walked across the room, but he didn't stop at the desk. Instead, he dropped to one knee, a gesture of absolute loyalty that would have shocked the world outside. "The board is clear, Ji-Hye," Min Jun said, his voice soft but steady. "The last of the syndicate's assets have been transferred. The city is officially yours. Every street, every dock, every life. You're the queen of the Vipers now." Ji-Hye looked down at him. She had the power she had craved. She had the money that could buy anything. She had the throne that her father had tried to keep from her. But as she looked at her fiancé, she didn't feel the warmth of a victory. She felt a strange, hollow echo in her chest. "Rise, Min Jun," she said, her voice sounding far away even to her own ears. "We don't need theater in this room." He stood up and walked around the desk, placing a hand on her shoulder. He looked at her with pride, but when Ji-Hye caught her own reflection in the darkened glass of the window, she froze. In the dim light, The jagged scar on her cheek seemed to pulse. The way she sat, the way she held her chin, and the cold, unblinking focus in her eyes. It was all too familiar. She wasn't looking at a survivor anymore. She was looking at a mirror of Young-sik. She had spent 10 years hating the man who had abandoned her, yet in the process of destroying him, she had molded herself in his exact image. She had become the same cold king who valued strategy over blood and power over peace. She had won the crown, but she had lost a girl who once believed in promises. "Are you okay?" Min-jun asked, sensing her sudden stillness. "I'm fine," Ji-Hye lied, her voice as sharp and polished as a diamond. She turned away from the glass and looked at the mountain of paperwork on the desk. "I have a city to run. Let's get to work." She had achieved everything she wanted, but as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the floor, Ji-Hye realized the darkest truth of the underworld. The throne is never a prize. It is just a different kind of safe house, and she was once again trapped inside.